Hello, online pipe community. Ethan, Parsimonious Piper here. Today we have a morsel for mental manducation. But first, in a Pipe by Lee 3-star billiard, similar to the one I smoked last week, I'm pretty sure, I've got another bowl of the Emerson Southern Forged Sumatra Seco. A very nice cigar leaf blend that I will discuss in a little bit more tomorrow. For today we're going to continue our journey in C.S. Lewis' Mere Christianity. We are up to the 3rd chapter of the 2nd book, 8th chapter overall, entitled The Shocking Alternative. Now, just to recap, last time we had discussed the comparison of traditional monotheistic religions such as Judaism, Islam, Christianity, to dualism, where the former have a creator God who is very much interested in goodness, in morality, and in various forms of dualism, which manifest themselves typically in polytheism. You have gods or groups of gods who are opposed to each other, and one side is good and the other is not. But we discussed the issue there of how do you decide then which side is good and which side is not, if one side is not the creator that defines good. Now, continuing then down that path, we're faced with this problem. Now, why would a God who is interested in good create a universe that was able to become full of so many things that are not good, that are bad or evil, or even meaningless? How did that happen, and why? Well, if this God is interested in goodness, truly interested in goodness, then any of the beings created would have to be free to choose to either do things that are good or not do things that are good. And this choice of doing things that are not good is really a necessary condition, this ability to choose those things, because otherwise, if you don't have any choice but to choose things that are good, are they really good? I can't imagine a logically consistent universe in which that was the case. And so, all created intelligent beings have this choice. Sorry for bumping the camera there. And the greater the being, the greater its capacity both for doing good and for doing evil. Lewis uses examples that are easy to follow and make sense. We say that a dog is good or bad specifically if it obeys. We say that a child is good or bad in a greater capacity to make moral decisions, and so on. An adult man has more moral culpability and can do greater harm or greater good. A genius can do great good or great evil. Imagine then a spirit being, if such a thing were created, being able to do even greater good or greater evil. than a human. And now where does the tendency toward bad or evil come in then? Well, as soon as a being is intelligent and can make choices, it is also keenly, in most cases, aware of self. And as soon as that awareness arises, comes the capacity and the temptation to put self first. Even to think that one's self is all there is, or a collection of selves, and to put yourself in ascendancy, morally speaking. But this creator would be the only being who truly has a right or a claim to that ascendancy, to the top position, because he made everything. It's just the way it is. Now we get into, and there will be people who will strongly object to my use of the word mythology, but we get into, and C.S. Lewis begins discussing the Christian Bible, the mythology surrounding Judeo-Christian beliefs. And I'm using that term simply because the Bible stories, whether they are true or not, are part of a mythology. Generally speaking, they are a collection of stories that describe and explain what Jews and Christians believe. Their truth claims are not really part of this discussion right now, because what I'm talking about is the purpose of the stories, and in particular, one, going all the way back to the very first book of the Bible, in its first few chapters, discussing origins, creation. And in the Garden of Eden story, the sin that was committed was not merely disobedience, not doing what Adam and Eve had been told. The sin was putting self first. The sin was giving into the temptation to be like God, or taking that ascendancy from God. To suppose that we know better than God does what we should do, what we shouldn't do. And that was the real fall there, was putting self first. And when we look at this concept of self being the origin of sin and evil in our world, it actually describes all of human history. You have a very consistent framework for describing human history. Societies and organizations have risen and fallen. They grow. Societies and organizations that do very good things, that govern well, have grown and grown and grown. And what has inevitably happened in every single one of those is that somewhere along the line, self creeps into the leadership, sometimes creeps into the people, and that society collapses. We see this pattern repeated over and over again, and there really aren't any exceptions in human history. Let's get relit here. Someone's or some group's sense of self takes ascendancy And that leads to the downfall. What we call the Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures, is a centuries-long story of one God's attempt to teach one people that he is the only God, and to teach them about him, about who he is, that he does in fact care about goodness, about moral behavior. It's a centuries-long lesson, sometimes humorous, sometimes painful, sometimes shocking. But it is an interesting story. And then, into this story of this God who's trying to teach one group of people who he is, into this story comes a man, suddenly, who quite shockingly speaks as if he is that God who has been trying to teach this people about himself. In fact, this man makes clear claims to being that God. He uses language that this people would understand in saying things like, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. I and the Father are one. Tell them I am. Repeatedly using language like that to describe himself in ways that this people would not mistake who he was claiming to be. Further, and to Lewis at least, most shockingly, this man claimed to be able to forgive sins. Now, we haven't talked about sins, but in the most general terms, we have talked about us knowing that there is this moral law, this universal we should and we shouldn't set of behaviors, and that we break those frequently, that we do not live up to what we know to be that moral law. In a nutshell, and without getting into any theological debates, that's what sin is. It's breaking that moral law that God has communicated to us. And this man claimed to be able to forgive that breaking of the moral law, which is something that only the God who created the law could do. Now, at this point, we see the formulation of what has commonly become known as C.S. Lewis' trilemma. You see, because of the language that he used and the things that he did and said, this man didn't really give us much room to wiggle. We can't just say, well, he wasn't God, but he was a great teacher. Well, he doesn't leave us that option because he claimed to be God. If he wasn't God, then he was either delusional, he was crazy, if he really believed that he was God, and he wasn't. And there is no other such lunatic in history that we would call a great teacher, except this one. We make exceptions here so that we don't have to follow the logical conclusion. So he was either crazy, or he knew he wasn't God, and he was just lying about it in order to do what? In order to gain followers? Well, maybe. They wound up killing him. But if he knew that he wasn't God and he claimed to be God, then he was deliberately deluding people. He was deliberately misleading them away from the real God. this would put him into the demonic. He would have been, considering the influence he's had on the history of the world, he was the greatest liar in history, if he knew he was not God. Now, the other option is the reason that so many people are willing to bend their own consistent rules and say, well, yeah, he was a liar. He knew he wasn't God, but he was a liar, but he was a good teacher. What other liar on that level would you ever call a good moral teacher? He's a liar. Or he was insane because he really did believe that he was God. What other lunatic would you call a great moral teacher? Name one. The truth is that if you came across someone today who claimed to be God and really believed that he was God, you would lock him up. And if he didn't, you would call him a cult leader. You would not call him a great moral teacher. And that leaves the only other option, as C.S. Lewis points out, and that is he was, in fact, who he claimed he was. One of those three has to be true. This famous trilemma has often been boiled down to three words that C.S. Lewis did not here put these together, but it's the liar, lunatic, or Lord trilemma. He's got to be one of those three things. There really isn't a fourth option. And that is the shocking place that we find ourselves at the end of today's discussion. Next week, we'll start getting into the consequences of this trilemma and where it leads us. But for now, chew on it. Light something you like. I do like this cigar blend. I think if you tune in tomorrow, you'll find out whether you might as well. Enjoy your afternoon.